Folks, and welcome back to my tutorial series on how to build a desktop application style object-oriented Discord bot in Python. So what did we look at last time? We created our profile details class, and we got all the information in it set up with with properties, and we also created a function to create a status embed in Discord. So let's look at what that entails. So we're going to say testing, and we're going to pick the one from our bot. And as you can see, we have this status embed, and it's going to have the character name here in the center, and it's got the rest of our details information down here as fields. Right, but this is pretty boring. Okay, so if we look at the main bot's profile details command and compare the two, we see a couple of major differences here. Mainly that this second one looks a lot prettier, and it has buttons down here. And we're going to use these buttons to edit the information within the embed. So if I click on character name and I change this to Allegro, it's going to update this message and it's going to say profile details for Allegro instead. If I get rid of other jobs, so if I get rid of that one there, it's going to delete it and it's only going to have two jobs for me. Similarly, we can edit the custom URL and we'll be able to edit the rates field as well. And then, of course, when we click Done Editing, it's going to clean up after itself and display our profile to us. Great, so that's going to be super fun. Let's get started. Okay, so back here in our IDE, let's open up the Common folder file under our UI folder, And before we define anything, I just want to bring your attention back to the stop function of our frog view that we made. So typically the stop function is not an async function. And I don't remember if I hit on this, but I want to just stress the importance that we make this async now. The reason that we're doing that is because we have this deletion behavior that we may potentially want to invoke if close on complete is true. And remember, we set that when we instantiate the view. So if we do want to clean up after ourselves, we're going to have to make this an async function in order for it to communicate with Discord and properly return the information to us for processing. I just wanted to point that out while we continue. So let's define a type of button that we can use for our profiles. So I want the behavior in our details, and in fact, I want the behavior in all of our status message buttons to be the same. In the sense that if a detail is not set, so if character name were not set, it would be displayed as one of these secondary button colors here. Okay, but since the main job, the color, and the name are all set in this particular circumstance, you can see that the buttons are primary colored, whereas our custom URL button is not. Okay, so let's go back over into the IDE and we'll create this behavior. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to define a class and we're going to call it profile button. And it's going to be a button subclass. And then I want to define the init. We're not going to do anything special in this init. So I just want to take in the args and the keyword args in case we have something that we want to pass to the button constructor later on from elsewhere in our code. And then we're just going to call the superclasses init constructor, and we're going to pass in the args and keyword args that we want. So if you notice here, if I pull these out for just a second, we can say inside these parentheses all the arguments that we would typically get for a button, because calling super.init is exactly the same as saying button equals button and passing our arguments into the constructor this way. So I don't want to do anything special in the init method, but I do want to come down here and I want to create a function called setStyle. Now the button style is what determines whether it's going to be a blue button, whether it's going to be gray, whether it's going to be green, or red, which you don't see here. And I want to make that an automatic decision, that the button's going to determine itself what it looks like. So again, if we have data in the parameter, we want the button to be a primary color. But if we are missing data, in the case of our profile URL, we want it to be secondary. I do want to point out that this example that I'm showing you here doesn't actually have that behavior. This is behavior that I've added in future iterations of the bot. So you'll notice that our profile URL is actually set, but the button color is still secondary. I hard-coded these button colors in at the time before I realized we can make a set style function to do it for us. So this is going to be a dynamic shift depending on whether there's data in the class or not. So let's create that. So let's say def set style, and we'll spell it correctly. And then in here I want to take an attribute. And this could be an optional value, but it could be anything. So I want to plan for that. We're not going to take any return, and then we're going to just make a simple if-else statement. Okay, so if we have a value in the attribute, so if the attribute is true, so there's no absence of a value, we're going to say the self.style of the button is going to be equal to button style dot primary. Okay, so that's going to give us the blue colored, the blurple colored button. Otherwise, I want to say self.style equals button style dot secondary, just like that. So either way, we're going to have a style applied to our button, but it's going to be dependent on whether there is data existing in the data point already. Okay, cool. So that's all I wanted to do for that. So we can go on to the next construct that's going to be important to us. So just like we subclassed out our view right here, I also want to subclass out a modal dialog. And this is going to be even simpler than subclassing out the button or the view. So all I want to say is class frog modal, just so we can differentiate from a regular modal, which is going to be a modal with an A, excuse me. And we're going to define the init. Again, we're not going to take any special arguments into this initializer. We're going to take arguments into the subclassed modals. But for now, when we're making our frog modal, we just want to take the args and the keyword args in case we need to pass anything to the constructor directly. And we can call the super call with args and keyword args. And then I want to create two attributes for our frog modal. And these are what's going to make this modal class so important. Okay, so I want to make a self.complete Boolean, and we're going to set this to false by default. Okay, so while the modal is being interacted with, if we don't set self.complete in the callback, our code is going to just ignore the value in the modal. So this is good for if the modal gets canceled. We don't want to continue in our code. So if we bring back up Discord and we say profile details and we open up a modal and then cancel it, we don't want canceling that to stop our view, to impact our code, to have any other actions. We just want to be able to click and cancel and still have interactivity within this particular view. Okay? So that's what we're going to use self.complete for. Our code is going to watch for that, and if it's not complete, it's going to ignore whatever just happened in the modal. Additionally, since the modal is going to be returning value, so for instance, if I open up this character name modal, it has a space for my name, and I want a way to capture that value and hand it back into our details class. So I'm going to say self.value, which could be an optional value since it's not going to be set automatically. And I'm going to set it to none. So this could be any value. This could be an integer, this could be a string, this could be a color if we decide to process a color in the callback of the modal. But for right now, we're just going to set it to none, and we will look for that value once the modal's been processed. So these are the two constructs that I wanted to create really fast. Let's export them in our Dunder all. So we've got profile button and frog modal. And then we should be able to close our common UI. And let's make a new file in our UI folder. Finally, and we'll call it details. So we'll do our standard imports. Annotations from Discord. I also want to, from Discord, import input text. So we're going to say input text style as well as interaction. From typing, we'll import type checking. And if we're type checking, let's pass for now as usual, and we'll come back to it. Okay. So what's the first thing that we want to add to this UI file for details? Well, let's look over here in Discord again. And additionally, a behavior that I'd like to talk about that we're going to implement, but I haven't really discussed, is the behavior that when our view times out, so notice that all these buttons are gone. So if I type in details, we get a prompt with buttons, right? However, after the view times out, after these buttons stop becoming interactable, we want to get rid of those. We don't want the user to think that they can still use these buttons. Now we could go about this by disabling them. However, it's still it still seems kind of cluttered to have a chunk of disabled buttons here that you can't use. So the behavior that we're going to be coding in later on is that once the view times out, we're going to get rid of the buttons. Anyway, let's talk about what comprises this view right here. So remember, the view that we're talking about is this bit right here with the buttons, and it's a container that contains all of the buttons. And what we're going to do is we're going to subclass out our custom view. So this is going to be a frog view, and then each of these buttons is also going to be a subclass. All right, because that's going to allow us to define behavior within the buttons that allows us to process whatever information that we put into a modal or provide via select option in the case of jobs, for instance. That's going to allow us to define more specific behavior that we want to use in this context. So I want to define the view that we're going to store these things in first. Okay, so here let's drop down a number of lines, because up here we're going to want to define our button subclasses eventually. But for now we want to define the view that's going to contain them. So we're going to say class details status view. And we're going to make this a subtype of frog view, which we haven't imported yet, so let's do that now. I want to say from UI, and since we made this a package, we put an init file in here, we're going to say import frog view. And then I also want to import profile button, like that. And in fact, I want to go back over into Common, and I want to rename this profile section button, just to be a little bit more clear. Okay, so let's make sure it updated in Dunder all. Very good. And then we can go back here into details, and it also updated in our imports. Awesome. So we're going to need that in a minute. But for now, let's define the init for our detail status view. First parameter we're going to take is the owner of the view. So let's look at a demonstration here. So if we go over here into our Discord, this is my main account. And if I type details, I can click this and I can interact with it as usual. However, if I pull up our testing account and I click on that same button, it's going to wait and wait and wait and then say interaction failed. Because we don't want people who aren't the profile's owner to be playing with the profile data. That would be just a cluster. And we don't want that. So the behavior that we're going to define is that we're going to restrict this view interaction to the person who invoked the command. Later on, we're going to build an administrator command that allows us to override that behavior. But for now, it's going to be directly correlated to the person who invoked the command. Awesome. So for this, the owner is going to be a union of either member or user. Now, the reason we're doing this is because later on, like I mentioned, we will have some support for private messaging and working on profiles in private messages, but that's going to be a while from now. However, regardless of how we get an invocation of this command, it's going to be either a member or a user. So it's either going to be from a guild context or a private message context, which is why we're planning for it this way. Let's also pass in the details profile object itself. So let's make sure that we say from type now under type checking, because remember our details profile object is going to be dependent on the UI class that we're creating in order to display that view. But we want access to all this data from the view. We want to be able to reach out of the buttons that we're creating and say, hey, what's in the character name? How am I supposed to style myself? What kind of data should be displayed in the modal, etc. So we want a reference to that here in the view. So to avoid making a circular dependency, we're going to say from classes.profiles, and we can just import details, profile details. Okay, so that's going to help us avoid circular dependencies there. We're also going to add args and keyword args so that we can pass in arguments to the view constructor from our code. So let's call this superclass, and we're going to pass in our owner, because remember, in our frog view, we're expecting the owner so it knows who this view belongs to. So we need to pass in the owner as well as any additional arguments and keyword arguments that we provide. Let's also cache that reference to our details object. So this is a profile details, and we're going to set it equal to details. So now we have this reference to it in the view that we can reach back out of our buttons and consult during the course of the command being invoked. Let's make a button list. This is going to be the list of buttons that we create inside the view. And then down here I want to say for button in button list, and we're going to say self.add item. So the view itself is going to say, okay, what's in this button list, and it's going to add that item. Okay? It'll make sense when we populate the button list, but I wanted to finish out this function before we move on to something else. So let's make a button subclass. What's the first bit of information that we're looking at? Well, let's make it a character name button. And this will be a profile section button because we want that special stylistic behavior. So let's make up the constructor. We're going to say def init and ddent. There we go. And then into the constructor, we're going to take the name, the character name itself. And we're going to be taking in the raw value from the details class. So this is going to be an optional string. We aren't going to ask for the property, which could potentially return the not set sentinel value. We don't need that in here. We just need whether it is here or not, and if it is, what that string value is. We don't need the sentinel value here. Okay, so let's make sure we import optional. And then we'll call the superclass of the button and pass in our desired information here, the desired style. So for the button label, I want to name it character name. For the disabled status, it's not going to be disabled, so we're going to make that false. And then I want this in the top row. Okay, so if we look back over here in Discord, let me invoke the command again. Character name, accent color, and main job are in the top row, and our other three attributes are going to be in the second row, because we don't want 5 buttons, which is the maximum number per row, and then 2 buttons down here or 1 button down here. That would look a little tacky. So we're making them even. Okay, and then you may have noticed that we forgot to set the style of the buttons. So we don't know whether it's going to be blue or gray or green or red right now. But this is where self.setStyle comes in. And in setStyle, our hint here says that we need to include an attribute, which could be optional any. Now I think you see where this is going. Let's pass the name in here. So now if we have a value in the name parameter in our profile details, it's going to mark that button as blurple, just to signify to the user that, hey, yeah, like this has data in it, you're good, and it's just going to give them a confirmation once it flips too. Okay, so this is what we need to define in the init. Let's come down here and say async def callback. As you can see, it's trying to autocomplete this for me, which means that this is an internal function of the button that's going to let us define what happens when the click when it is clicked. So basically think of callback as when this component is activated, this is what we're going to do. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to get an easier reference to our details right here. And we're going to say details equals self.view.details. Just because that's a little long, and I would much rather just refer to it by details instead of having to put self.view each time. Okay, so we're going to invoke a function in the details class that we haven't created yet, but we're going to go over and create that in a minute. And so we want to say await details.setCharacterName. And I want to pass in the interaction that we get implicitly into this function. So the library passes us the interaction that has all of the surrounding data of the button click. And I want to pass that into the setCharacterName function, and you'll see why we do that in a second. Now, since we're awaiting for this, it's going to either change the data in in our details class, or it's not. So after that, I want to say self.setStyle again, and I want to say details.characterName. And make sure we do it with the underscore because we're referencing the raw attribute, not the property. So again, we're coming back here and we're setting the style based on whether or not the character name was changed in this function. And again, we haven't defined that yet, but we'll get there in a second. The last thing we need to do is, just because we've set the style of the button doesn't automatically mean that it updates it in Discord. So what we would need to then do is we would need to say then await interaction.message.edit, and then we would need to pass the embed, which is details.status, because that refers back to our details object. But the issue here is that depending upon how we've responded to this interaction, we need to perform a different edit behavior. So we very well may, if this is the first response to this interaction, we would need to say await interaction dot response dot, perform task. But in this case, or in another case, we may have responded to it by sending an actual message, and then this is being invoked from the message that was sent. Okay, that's a little confusing. Let's look at a demonstration here in Discord. So if we perform the details command, okay, so this is our initial interaction response. So the / command itself is an interaction in Discord, and we can always respond to an interaction one time. We can follow up an interaction multiple times, but we can only perform one proper response. So if we click a button, this is also an interaction, and we can perform our response by sending this modal input. Okay, however, we can also perform a response by sending another message. And as you can see here, this is actually referencing the message that was sent. So this message reference is actually this message right here. So this one down here is what's considered a follow-up. Okay, so a follow-up can be anything, and we have to respond to that differently than a proper response, which you would get by sending a modal, for instance. Okay, so let's get rid of that and minimize this. Okay, so how do we deal with the fact that we need to respond to our interaction in potentially one or another way? Well, I want to go back into our utils file, and we're going to define a function that does this for us. So let's just go down here to the bottom, and we're going to define an async function called edit message helper. Okay, and it's going to take in an interaction. So this is it's going to be able to analyze the interaction that we're passing in. And let's make sure that we import interaction from the Discord namespace. And in addition, it's going to take in the arguments and keyword arguments, parameters, and it's not going to return us anything. Okay? So this is going to be actually some pretty simple logic. We're going to try one action to start. So we're going to say we want to try await interaction.message.edit. Okay, so we're going to check to see if it's a follow-up first. And we're going to say args and keyword args. Because again, this is just a way of us passing in whatever arguments we want into these functions. And these functions can handle that because of the way in which they parse the keyword arguments. So this is the same type of logic that's going on internally inside PyChord's functions. So when we do this here, when we do an interaction.message.edit, which is already defined in our library, it's performing that same behavior of looking through the keyword arguments and finding what we're looking for, which is why we pass this as a generalized parameter. Okay, so we're going to try and edit this. But let's say that fails. If we edit it, great, it's done. But if we don't, we want to try the other route, okay? So we want to await the interaction.edit original response. Okay, so this is going to be performing an edit on the initial interaction response. And we just want to pass in args and keyword args here as well for the same logic. Now, let's say that we've made a mistake and that this fails as well. In that case, we're just going to pass. Okay, it's not important enough that we write something complicated that deals with our exceptions. That, you know, if one message every so often doesn't get deleted, it's not the end of the world. So we're going to pass here. So we've tried to we've tried to edit our interaction message follow up, and if that doesn't work, we're going to try and We're trying to edit the original response, and if that doesn't work, we're just going to pass. So let's make sure we export the edit message helper up here. And then we can close utils. Okay, so let's make sure we've imported utils up here. So from utilities, import star. Okay, and then in our character name button, after we've set the style, we're going to use the edit message helper function that we just created, and I want to pass it three things. So we're going to give it the interaction that it's expecting, and that's going to be the interaction that was generated when we clicked this button. And then I want to pass it the embed that we're going to pass back, which is, of course, details.status. And then I want to pass it the view as well, because we not only changed the value inside the status embed, but we also changed the style of the button potentially. So we're going to say self.view for that. And just like that, now we have a button that's going to allow us to click it, run this function, which we have not defined yet, but this function is going to present us with a modal pop-up that lets us set the name. And then once we've interacted with that modal pop-up, this button is going to determine its own style, again, based on what we put in. And then we're just going to update the message that it was attached to. Okay, so let's go down here to the details status view, and we'll add an instance of this button and make sure we instantiate it. And then what it's asking for here is the name. So we're passing in the name parameter, which is the actual name attribute of profile details. So let's just say self.details._care name, excuse me. Okay, so again, this is going to look in that button list, which we've now made an instance of the character name button, and it's going to add that to the view for us. Okay, so let's go back over here into our details class, and let's define this set character name button, because if we interact with this button right now, it's not going to do anything, and in fact, it's going to give us an error because we haven't actually defined this function. So let's define this. Let's go down here to the bottom. And I'll make a new function, and we're going to call it async def set care name. And this is going to take in an interaction, which is the interaction that we generated by clicking the button, and it's not going to return us anything. But for now, before we even start this, I want to define the modal that we're going to use to gather the data. So here in our UI details, let's add another line down here, and we're going to say class care name modal, and I want to make this a frog modal. Okay, make sure frog modal is imported at the top of your module, excuse me. And for this, we're going to say def init, and from the init, I want to take the current value, which is an optional string, because that's our base data, that's our base attribute for details. Okay, and you'll see the significance of why we take in this current value here in a moment. But to start, I just want to say super.init, and we're just going to pass the title, okay? Because the only thing we need to tell our superclass constructor is what this modal is going to be named. And we're just going to call it a character name modal. There we go. Okay. So let's add some input texts, because right now we have a modal with a title and no text inputs, no callback, no nothing. So let's say self.addItem, and we're going to say input text. And make sure we have input text imported from the Discord UI namespace right here. Okay, you may not have done that. I did that while I was testing something out and forgot to remove it, so you will need to do that import. And we want to specify a handful of things to the constructor for the text input. the value this layout that I want to use for this is I want to have one text input giving our user instructions, and then I want to have a second input for the actual entry. Because as I've said before, our user doesn't always know what we're trying to communicate. We need to be explicit about what our intentions are, which is why all of our modal pop-ups, or most of at least, are going to have an instructions field to start. And we're going to disregard any information that's entered in the instructions field, because that's not going to apply to our code. That's not going to go into our profile. Only the value that the user enters is going to be transferred to our profile. So you'll see how we do that. So let's first define the style of the input text. We could have one of two input text styles. We could have single line or multi-line. Okay, and those should be pretty self-explanatory. For this one, we want to have a multi-line field. We always want to have a multi-line field for our instructions, even if they're short, just for continuity's sake. And for the label, I want to pass instructions. And so we can define a placeholder, and we can also define a value. Okay, so the place, and I know we have a lot of squigglies here, but the placeholder is going to be the short text that appears when there is no value in the box. And the value is actual text that has been entered in the box itself. So we can use this for a default value. We can use this to give more explicit instructions, more verbose instructions, because our placeholder has a limit of 100 characters, I believe. It's a pretty short limit, so we don't want to be too explicit in that. So let's just say enter your character's name. This is the basic information that the person needs if our instructions get deleted, basically. But down here in the value, we can be more verbose. We can say enter or edit your character's name on the line below. Okay, so this is wordier, and it gives more explicit instructions to the user about what to do. However, if this line gets deleted somehow, we still have a fallback that's hard-coded into the input text. And finally, let's make this not required. We're going to set that to false. Because again, if the user deletes the text from this box, we don't want to force them to put text in the box in order to submit the modal. The only part that's going to be required is the second part, which is going to be where they put their character's name. So let's define that. So for this style, I want to use input text style.singleLine, because this is not going to be a long chunk of text. This is going to be a single word or two. And for the label, we'll say character name. And for the placeholder, I want to give the user an idea of what to put in there if there's nothing in the box. Because this may be a new profile, and they may mean, what do you mean by character name? So I like to put, for example, and I'll just put my character's name. So this is giving them an idea of what they should be putting in this box if there's nothing here. What about the value? Do we want to set a default value in the box? Well, actually, yes, we do. We want to pass the current value from our details class into the value, because if we have none here, the input text will handle none in this value slot. So that will literally just make it a blank box, in which case, if we have a blank box, it will display our placeholder. But if in our profile details we do have a current value, if they have previously set their character's name and it exists and is passed into this modal by the function, then it's going to display right here instead of nothing, which is the behavior we want, right? So this is required because we always want to make sure that they have their character name here. You know, some things like our URL or our rates section, we want them to be able to delete those things. We want those to be nullable. But our character name is literally the point of this profile. So it's one of the few things that we're going to require that they always have and that they cannot submit a blank box for. And the last thing I want to specify here is the max length. So we always need to be conscious of our embed character limit, which is 6,000 total characters throughout the embed. So for our max length, I feel like 50 is an acceptable length for a character's name, considering how much text we'll be putting in later between likes, dislikes, rates, personality, and things like that. we want to keep some of these fields a little shorter. Okay, so that's what we need for our inputs. Let's go ahead down here and we'll define our callback. So back here in our frog modal, we define these two attributes, right? We define self.complete and we also define a value, which could be anything. So I think you might see where we're going with this here in the callback. The first thing we want to do is say if the button was clicked. So Discord already does the validation that says something has to be in this box. So we already know that something is in this box. So the button has been clicked, there's something in the box. So we want to say self.complete equals true. So the modal was completed and submitted successfully. Excellent. So that's going to apply later on outside of our code. We also want to grab the value that the user put into this second box, right? Because the first box is just our instructions. We don't care about those. We know what we wrote, I hope. But the second box is where the juicy bit is. So we want to say self.value, that attribute that we created in the frog modal class, is going to be equal to self.children sub1.value. So this is child sub 0 where our instructions are, and this is child sub 1 right here. And so when this is submitted back to us after it's been clicked, we now have values in our children. The value parameter has been updated to what was entered in Discord. Hopefully that makes sense. So remember, every time we receive an interaction, we have to properly respond to it, or Discord will inform the user that there was an error. And obviously, we don't want errors at any stage of the process. So every time we get an interaction, we need to respond in some way. So a lot of the time, we're going to be responding with just a dummy interaction back. But for my dummy interactions, I like to say interaction.response.editMessage with no parameters, no arguments. We're just going to edit a message with, we're going to send back a blank edit. And that's not going to have any behavior in Discord. It's going to be basically a silent thumbs up. Okay, good. And then the last thing that we need to do is say self.stop. So this is literally the call telling the modal to close. Now, just because we've gotten a button click and there's input and we've collected that input and we've responded to the interaction does not inherently mean that we close the modal. So we have to explicitly say, okay, shut down that pop-up, we're done with it. All right, does that make sense? So let's make sure that we export that in our all, which we haven't defined. Shame on us. So let's do that now. And what do we want to define in that? What do we want to export here? Well, I think the detail status view and the character name modal are the only things, because the character name button that we've defined here, we're only using that internally within the view. So as long as we export this view, we should be good. Right? So let's say detail status view and also character name modal. Great. So no more squigglies. We're done in our details UI for the time being. So let's head back over to the profile details class and set this up. So we want to go ahead and import our UI first. So let's say from UI, and we've made this a package, right? So we can just say import star, because we're going to be using a lot of the functionality from this later on. So back down here, let's say modal equals character name modal. And if you remember, we need to pass in the current value of the character name, the raw value, which is self._character name. Okay, so let's jump back over into UI details just to look here. In the button, in the character name button, so after we've clicked the button, we're doing this function, right? We're immediately passing the interaction that we generated upon the button click into the set character name function, which is this guy right here. So immediately after generating the button click, we give us the interaction, we get the modal. What are we going to do? We're going to await interaction.response.send modal. We want to immediately respond to that button click by sending our modal to the user. And but we don't inherently know that we want to wait for this modal, right? We've sent it, we've communicated to Discord that a modal pop-up should be communicated to the user, but our code doesn't inherently know that this is a feature for which we need to wait for a response. So we need to say await modal.wait. And this is going to tell our code to twiddle its thumbs, to hang out right here until either this modal has timed out, has been closed, or has been submitted with data. So that's what we're waiting for here. Now, this point that we're at now, this is if the modal has been submitted and completed successfully. Well, maybe, because if the modal times out, if the user just waits and waits and waits, or walks away from the computer, or expires while the modal has popped up, we're going to eventually time out, and our code is going to continue. So how do we know if there's a value that has been grabbed in that modal? How do we know that this callback has actually been executed if the modal timed out? We wouldn't have anything in this value parameter, and so we would, if we tried to access it, we would get an error, right? So this is where self.complete comes in. This is where the complete attribute of the modal comes in. So since we've set this to true, we can check for this being true so that we know that a value has been assigned. So if not modal.complete, so if the modal has not completed, that means we don't need to do anything else. That means that this is a non-issue, so we can just return. Okay, but what if the modal is completed? Well, what do we get from this? We get a string value from an input text, right? So the user has submitted their username, which in my case is Allegro Vivo. So this value would be a string value. So all we need to do is say self.charactername equals modal.value. And then we can return. Just like that. So remember to use the property for character name here and not set it to the raw attribute, because again, we're going to put database update logic in these properties. We're going to make the database update call. So this prevents us from having to say self.charactername equals value and then having to say self.update later on. Okay, so the update is going to be inherently part of the property, and it's going to automatically run when we assign the value. Okay, so I think it's time to test. Let's go ahead and double check and make sure our cog is set up properly. Okay, good. But we don't have a reference to the view that we made, right? The details status view. So what I want to do for this is I want to go into our cog, and we're going to define that view here. So let's make sure that we've imported UI. So from UI, I want to import, let's just import the details status view for now. We'll import a few more classes later, but in the cogs specifically, I like to be a little bit more explicit in here. And in addition, we're going to have to take out the future annotations line later when we import, when we start using options in our slash commands. So at that time, when we take this out, it's going to be even more important that we're explicit with our imports. So that's why I'm only importing the details status view from the UI namespace right now. So down here, I'm going to just say view equals a details status view. And then this wants the owner and the details. Okay, so the owner we can actually get from ctx.user. Okay, so this is going to tell it who owns it. And then we'll just pass in the details that we made right up here. Okay, so the last thing we need to do, similar to what we did over here with the modal.wait, our code doesn't inherently know that sending a view is something we need to wait for. So in addition to passing our view to the respond command, to the respond function, like this, we also need to say await view.wait. So again, our code will now sit here and wait for this view to finish dispatching, which at no point have we told this view to stop dispatching. So the only time it'll stop is when it times out, which is okay for now. We'll define additional behavior for that later on, but since the goal of this is a desktop style application that is not just a flat single command, single interface, single message type of thing, we want this view to continue dispatching for a chunk of time before it stops responding. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So now we should be able to start our bot and interface with the character name button. So let's type in testing. Okay, all right, we're in business. Now you're probably like, wait, but the character name button is gray. Well, right, because our set style function saw that there is not currently any information in the character name attribute. So it set this value to gray so that it signifies to the user, hey, we need to click this. We need to input this information that we've set up this lovely modal for. And we've got a placeholder here, so I can type over it and the placeholder goes away. And in addition, as you can see, when I've deleted everything from the character name box, it is highlighted in red and it says, hey, you need to put in a value between 0 and 50, which was our maximum value for this field. And likewise, if I delete the instructions, we get our shortened version of the instructions, but no error because it's not required. So let's type in our name and we'll submit it. And as you can see, now our profile details embed message has been updated in that our character name is here, and our button color has been updated as well. And we can click it again. And we can change it to another value. And that'll update our profile details status. Okay, excellent. So we're in business. I think this is an excellent place to stop the video for now. We'll go ahead and implement additional behaviors for this in the next video and hopefully finish up the profile details class. So, hey, thanks for watching.